PEFA has been around now for about 15 years. I think it came about as a sort of an inspiration by the 7 partners of PEFA as a way of trying to develop a common methodology so that people would be able to firstly apply the same approach in a wide range of countries, that countries wouldn't be subject to a number of different but similar kinds of assessments, and that the data that would be produced as a result of these analytical procedures would be useful for the countries that are actually doing the tests, but also to have wider value because of comparability and similarity with tests done in neighbouring countries and in other countries, and also to be repeated in the future in the same countries to provide a basis for monitoring and ongoing assessment of progress on the reform agenda. At the last count, we have 149 countries that have used the PEFA methodology, and with around about 500 specific reports being produced as a result of PEFA assessments. So it's now probably not just a well-established methodology, but one which has provided a fairly substantial database for research, for PFM reform development, and also for comparison with progress over time. PEFA's one of the valuable things about PEFA is that it actually covers practically every region of the world. It covers every income group from high income down to the most less developed and fragile state. It also covers different institutional arrangements such as Francophone countries, Lusophone, Anglophone, former Soviet countries, transition countries. And the other thing that has become a much more substantial part of the PEFA report stable over the last few years has been subnational assessments. I think the greatest growth over the last 2 years since I've been involved in PEFA has been in the subnational level. I think this has been really valuable experience for the PEFA Secretariat and for the countries involved, because we've seen countries in every continent who have used the PEFA methodology either for an individual or a group of subnational governments, and sometimes in combination with a national assessment. So the range of applications for PEFA has expanded in depth and also in breadth. The leadership of assessments is done by a number of different types of organisation. At one level, we have individual governments who do self-assessments. Sometimes they do this after having had an external organisation do an initial assessment, and then follow-up successive assessments are done by the country themselves. Often the assessments, and probably the majority of assessments, have been done through the European Commission and through the World Bank. I think more than half of the assessments so far have been done by the World Bank and European Commission, but there's been increasing interest by people like SECO, the IDB, the IMF. Most recently, we've had KfW from Germany do a number of subnational assessments in Tanzania, and other organisations have shown an interest. But I think the areas that I'm most proud of in terms of the use of PEFA have been the countries that have taken it on as something part of their own PFM reform agenda, seeing it as something that's useful for them without being influenced by anybody else to do the assessment, and have seen the way in which that can be applied for their own benefit. I guess the genesis of the upgrade was really the evaluation in 2012 for PEFA. That was a very exhaustive assessment of the first 3 phases of PEFA, and one of the issues that came out of it was that there'd been a lot of lessons learned as a result of 5 or 8 years of application of PEFA. There were a number of refinements that were identified in the methodology, some of which had been applied to upgrading the indicators initially. But there was a question about whether, if PEFA was to remain relevant in the future, whether it was a matter of incremental change or of a big bang reform approach. And the partners at the time decided to take a big bang approach, that it was better to upgrade the PEFA on a large scale to try and get as many of the changes that were identified as possible into the new framework, to reflect the developments in the wider PFM reform agenda and the general increase in public financial management standards across the world, to make sure that PEFA continued to be relevant, continued to apply to good practice around the world, so that countries would be able to measure themselves against themselves, but also have an idea of how they compared with other countries. I think the upgrade process has been very effective in a number of ways, because it started with a very extensive technical review by professionals who were looking at the methodology in terms of not just whether it measured what was intended to be measured, but also whether it was measuring the right things, was covering the right scope, and was able to provide the kind of input that people needed for, say, dialogue on the development agenda, or to contribute to PFM reform more generally, or to apply to the needs of a variety of different countries and different levels of government. So as part of that process, we developed a consultation version after the technical process, which was again an exhaustive approach for refining the findings of the technical review, to transform that into something that was then applicable in a practical situation in any country, using the same principles that have been developed to provide the foundation of PEFA right from the very beginning. And then that consultation version was opened up for public discussion for a period of around about 3 months. We received more than 800 specific comments across the entire framework from people who were providing very robust feedback. And so out of that, those 800 plus refinements that were suggested, comments that were providing suggestions for us, we developed a testing version. The testing version was slightly different to the consultation version in terms of the coverage, but I think what the consultation did tell us was that we were on the right track, and that was quite comforting to think that after all of the development work, we were still on the right track. The PEFA methodology has been around now in testing version for almost a year. We've gone through a long phase of testing and discussion with the steering committee, and I think now at the beginning of December, we have finally reached the stage where the steering committee and partners are comfortable with the methodology and the report format that has been developed. So the next phase for us over the next few weeks is to look at getting the document edited and producing a final version for our website around about the 1st of February 2016. The testing that we did for PEFA over the last 12 months has been quite exhaustive, and it was quite well structured in a number of ways. We did tests in more than 17 countries across practically every region in the world, including countries that have different income levels, from different institutional heritages, and who have different size and complexity and levels of concentration in their financial management systems. Mauritius was particularly helpful in a number of ways, because they were part of a group that were testing a combination of the 2011 and 2015 version. So we were able to look at both methodologies through the one test at one time. It was probably one of 7 or 8 countries that did that. We also had a number of countries who were testing a small number of indicators, particularly the new indicators. We also had a group who were testing the full methodology, including the report, and that gave us a fairly wide breadth of understanding of how the methodology worked in different phases. The other advantage of Mauritius is that it has a number of specific characteristics. It's an island state. It's in the sub-Saharan African region, and it represents a particular type of country that we wanted to have covered in the group. I think one of the other advantages that we have with Mauritius is that they've done a PEFA before, so to some extent they're familiar with the methodology. It gave us a chance to look at how the methodology works through a successive assessment, and it also helped us to identify the kinds of things that are problematic or symptomatic of the kind of system that Mauritius has. I think the challenges that we had during the testing phase initially were that we were working very quickly. We had a number of deadlines that we wanted to achieve. There was certainly an expectation that the testing would be conducted quickly. So there was a big expectation on the Secretariat to produce guidance quickly, to provide considerable support to the countries undertaking the testing, while continuing with the regular workload that we had. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, 2015 was a particularly busy year for the Secretariat. We had more assessments for review during the period than practically any other year in PEFA's past, which in one way is a wonderful thing, but in another way, when you're trying to test and analyse the results of an upgraded methodology, it puts a lot of pressure on a small staff that we have. And I think one of the great advantages of PEFA is that we have a very experienced staff who have known PEFA for a long time and are very effective in supporting PEFA projects. Other challenges that we faced were how to address the kind of issues that were being raised by people doing the tests and trying to determine how significant they were in terms of what needed to be changed in the methodology, because there are two layers of issue that you need to consider when you're going through a testing phase. One is the technical methodology that you're trying to test. Does it work? Is the data available? Is it something that's reasonable to expect in a short period of time? Is it cost effective? And the other issues are much more high level. How is it going to affect the interpretation of the results? What's the relevance of it to wider public financial management reform? And how does this perform relative to the previous version? And how can we refine it even more to achieve the overall program objectives? So to some extent, we were able to test that on the technical level quite well because we had a large number of assessments. I think probably the biggest challenge for us lies ahead in not just applying the methodology on a much wider scale, but also seeing how we can leverage PEFA to be a much more effective part of public financial management reform than it has been in the past. I think one of the strengths of the testing phase is that's provided reassurance to the partners, to the Secretariat, and also to countries that this methodology is much better than the previous version and that we can apply it to a much wider range of issues and a much wider range of countries than we have in the past.